First thing I'll say is that we are going to be recording this exciting lecture today. And Dave Hoyt, you can kick that off now.
Okay, thank you.
So, I'll give you a full intro, Mary. Don't worry.
I was ready to go.
Yeah, just right at the starting block. So, welcome everyone to the Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium presentation today, titled "When Words Are Not Enough: Graphic Memoir and Mental Health" by Professor Mary Wood. So, a couple reminders to the audience: please mute yourself. Closed captioning is available via just a button press down to your browser, part of the WebEx. If you have questions about any of that, please privately message Dave Hoyt, who is my project manager, our center's project manager, and our orchestrator of this whole event. So the 2022-23 Oregon Bioethics and Humanities Colloquium, or OBHC, is a 5-part series where we aim to create a space for thought-provoking discussion and exploration in complex bioethical issues, touching on the medical humanities, health policy, cutting-edge research. We aim to create an environment where that fosters the critical examination of the human experience, and we seek to provide new, innovative perspectives that will challenge everyone who attends. And I anticipate that today we'll do just that. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Wood, who is our speaker for today. Mary and I have actually become quite close friends over the last year, and so it's a real honor to have her here. Mary is a professor of English literature at the University of Oregon. Her interests include medical and health humanities, 19th and 20th century American literature, disability studies, science literature, archival studies, and queer studies. She also has an interest in the digital humanities and continues to learn more about the possibilities in that exciting field. She has written several articles as well as 2 books on literature and mental health and illness, called The Writing on the Wall and Life Writing and Schizophrenia: Encounters at the Edge of Meaning. She loves to research, think, and write collaboratively across disciplines and national boundaries, as evidenced by her contribution to the newly released collection Madness and Literature: What Fiction Can Do for the Understanding of Mental Illness. And her and I and a couple others, including Jason Webb, who's on this call, will be collaborating on a paper at the moment. So without further ado, I will monitor the chat box while Professor Wood speaks. Please write your comments there, and I will collate them, and we will have a robust Q&A at the end of her talk. And so without any other further ado, feel free to turn off your cameras if that helps you listen, and then we can turn them back on, if you will, at the end of the talk. Thank you. And take it away. Dave, you can open up the slides.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And I really want to thank Tyler Tate for inviting me to give this talk. And it's been such a pleasure working with Tyler over the last year. And thanks also to Dave for helping with all the logistics and making this happen. So, okay. I have to, this little pop-up. Okay, so I wanted to say, so yeah, I'm going to talk today about graphic memoir and mental health. And you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Dave. And before I get started, I do, a lot of the work I do is in disability studies, and so we always talk about terminology from that point of view. And one thing I want to say, right off the bat is that I come to this topic as a scholar. I've always been interested in literature and mental health, and particularly life writing, autobiography, memoir. But I also, my mother had schizophrenia for 35 years, and as did my grandmother and my great-grandfather, who died in the Oregon State Mental Hospital. So I also have a lot of personal exposure, and I was very fortunate in that my mother, before she died, we had many conversations about her experiences. So some of which I've written about actually in one of my books. So I always like to put that out there as part of what informs my interest in this topic. So there's you know, every one of these terms that's up on the slide is controversial within disability studies. So mental health, you know, is probably the least controversial one, which is why it kind of ended up in the title of the talk. Mental illness, of course, is struggle with emotional, mental, and neurological well-being. But some people don't like this term. Others do like it. Some people feel that who experience mental illness feel that they do have an illness and they want to call it that, and others feel uh, more that they really are neurodiverse, which is another term down the line there. Still, others use the term madness, and they actually want to embrace that term and use it with pride. And others would find the term madness very dehumanizing. So you know, again, I just wanted to complicate things from the very beginning by saying that any terms that I use here are fraught. And I choose mostly to use for this talk the terms mental health and mental illness. In a different context, I would probably use different terms. And then in disability studies, there's always a focus on person-centered thinking and person-centered models that really put the individual, the person who's experiencing the illness or disability at the center and look at things from their point of view. And occasionally I'll use the term psychiatric survivor, which refers, usually people use that about if they've had experience in mental hospitals or very intensive experience with psychiatric services that were themselves traumatic. So okay, so those are the terms. You could go ahead. You're good at this, Dave. I can see that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just briefly about kind of the roots of graphic forms, because I think I'm always a historian. I like to know where things come from. And also I think these some of the earliest forms of what now we call comics really have influenced graphic memoirs that have to do with mental health and mental illness. So Japanese manga, of course, is one of the earliest forms dating back to the 19th century. Some people date it back earlier. And Astro Boy is sort of the classic Osamu Tezuka, who was very influential in creating manga. And manga has been, a real source of kind of iconic heroes and monsters that you'll see in some of the examples I'm going to use later on that represent mental health struggles. Okay. Next one. Bande dessinée is the French version, also dating back to the 19th century. Some of you are probably familiar with these two examples. Hergé, the Adventures of Tintin, was one of the first comics that actually put words and images together in ways that where the words were not just repeating what was happening in the pictures or describing it, but they were actually kind of working, sometimes in tension, sometimes together. And I included the Little Prince because I think it's one of those works that an early work that really represented experiences of loneliness and even dissociation, we might say. So I think these two have had a lot of influence on the works I'm going to be talking about. Next one. And of course, we have to include superheroes, because superheroes, even though they don't necessarily appear always in these examples we'll be looking at in a minute, the idea of kind of drawing on the superhero icon as a source of strength is something that is kind of in the background of a lot of the works that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Next one. Now, we really can't talk about this topic at all without talking about Maus. And some of you may be familiar with Maus. It was very controversial when it first came out, serialized in the 1980s, because Spiegelman was really one of the first people, if not the first, to take on a really serious subject and try to represent it using a graphic form. And it was controversial because it's about the Holocaust, he's trying to represent his father's experience in Auschwitz and the very traumatic experience. And he represents the Jews as mice and Nazis as cats. And when it first came out, people were kind of like, oh, this is trivializing the Holocaust. how could he do this? But when they, when they actually started reading it and seeing what he was trying to do, and I think this kind of, yeah, I see in the chat, some of you have read it. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And again, I think it's essential for pretty much every one of the graphic memoirs that I'm going to be talking about, because it deals with trauma, it deals with mental illness, and as this panel that I chose, the mouse figure in the upper left hand panel, that is kind of a representation of Art Spiegelman himself. His father is on the right, and even though they're driving in the car, and this is the present moment of the memoir, but his father's always represented as wearing the kind of the prisoner, the striped prisoner outfit that he wore in Auschwitz, so that he's never able to take that off, even though they're now in New York and living their lives in a very different way. And we see the Art Spiegelman figure saying, "I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams." And so that, I think the title of the talk here, "When Words Fail," is kind of, what do I do when I can't find words? Well, sometimes images need to come in and do something that's inexpressible. So, okay, next slide. Thank you. These are some helpful ideas that come from comics theory, which is like a really big field right now. It's been a growing field that's like super interesting. And so one of the things to know is that theorists in this field talk about how word and image work usually in tension, sometimes together. Sorry, I'm laughing at the comments in the chats. Great, keep them coming. There's a comment about the being banned in Tennessee school district. Yeah, because it is kind of radical. So the other thing is that some theorists talk about how word and image both are actually images and both need to be decoded by the reader. I mean, reading is decoding, right? And so one of the things that can happen in this form is that through the unexpected, familiar code is broken and sensation feeling evoked. And so I purposely messed up the word broken to kind of produce what they're talking about here, which is, if you're reading along here, you come to that word, first of all, your brain makes it into the word broken, which is something that happens in this medium, is that our brain's constantly making meaning and looking for meaning. And then you also might have a kind of uncomfortable feeling there, like, why did she not spell out the whole word when every other word is spelled out? You might think, oh, did she make a mistake? Is she not careful? Or like, this doesn't, some kind of unease might come out of seeing that unexpected. So this is something that is going to happen in this form quite a bit. And these theorists talk a lot about how the reader's imagination is a huge part of how meaning is formed, by piecing together the fragments that were generally given in a graphic memoir. And this whole process, I think this is really key. This whole process can mirror an experience of a mental health struggle, which is that we're given a bunch of fragments and we try and make sense out of them. And I think often this is, some of these memoirists, they use that aspect of reading comics where you don't get like a linear narrative necessarily. You have to decode a lot of information that's all together on the page. And that often is how they're experiencing the world. And I will say, I mean, the memoirs we're going to look at, some of them, most of them I'd say were written by people experiencing mental health struggles. Some of them were written by family members, and some were written by also people who have worked with people with mental illness. So they're not all memoirs by people who themselves experienced struggles. So I just want to throw that in there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so again, what graphic memoir can do that it can do well. I'm not saying other forms can't do these things, but graphic memoir can do it, can do these things in a particularly a powerful way, I would say. And one is to create two different kinds of selves, basically, at least two. And often you have a narrator who's represented in kind of the, the text box that will be in a panel. who's telling us the story, usually a story of the past. And then we have the drawn younger self. Often it's a child self, not always. Sometimes it's another adult self. And they're not always doing the same things or saying the same things or enacting the same feeling even. So that's something that this form can do. That it can also like really manipulate time and represent memory in interesting ways. And we're definitely going to be looking at that. And that it can really show a contrast between the inner world, the inner experience that may be very difficult to put into words, and then a kind of external experience of just living in the world. That tension is really can be really represented. And again, this form can really create feelings in the reader, as we said a minute ago, but through that tension between, not just the tension between words and images, but a tension between what we can figure out and what we can't figure out. In other words, there are always feelings that kind of remain beyond words, but they can be represented or at least alluded to by images. So, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some different themes that run through, and then give some examples in the memoirs themselves. So the first theme is diagnosis. Okay, this is a big one. And so this is a pretty well-known graphic memoir called Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me by Ellen Forney, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I think just that upper left-hand part of the panel, or part of this page rather, says a lot, right? So we get, Forney, and she refers to herself throughout the text by her name. So, Ellen basically is like, I don't want to be bipolar anymore. I quit. And then, we got kind of a lot of symbols that she's reproduced in other parts of this memoir that represent particularly her feelings of mania. So you see on the kind of right side of that figure, that looks like, okay, I don't want this anymore. And you see the swing going back and forth really wildly. And she's just like, I'm done with this. And in this case, we see below that she represents herself talking to her therapist a lot. And it's really significant, I think, that she really trusts this therapist. They're always portrayed kind of on the same level, facing each other. There's a kind of comfort and order to those representations. So for Forney, that relationship is portrayed as really kind of giving her stability through all of the difficulties. And then on the right side of the page is where a friend is telling her, she tells a friend, I have bipolar, I've been diagnosed with bipolar. And her friend, of course, right away goes to Sylvia Plath. And what's interesting about that, I think, is later in the memoir, Forney talks about her younger self kind of grasping for this artist and this kind of romanticized image of mental illness, and particularly bipolar disorder, and trying to find a way with the diagnosis to make something positive out of it, to kind of claim it for herself. And later on, she's like, well, that's not the right way to go. I don't want Sylvia Plath to be my model, since she took her own life. And she rejects that. But at this point, she's looking to make sense to, and I think this is sometimes, the part that that clinicians don't necessarily see, is how the person takes that diagnosis and then fits it into the narrative of their own life, or tries to fit it into the narrative of their own life. So next slide. So this is, I'm going to just be upfront and say, this is my favorite at the moment. My favorite thing that I've read always changes. But so this is an amazing graphic memoir called Bitter Medicine, a graphic memoir of mental illness. So this, both the Forney memoir and this one are very out there about that they're writing a memoir about mental illness and their experience of it. So Clem Martini is actually the brother of Olivier. Olivier was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they also had another brother who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, who took his own life, who died by suicide before Olivier's diagnosis. And so that's part of the history of Olivier's diagnosis and what it means for the family. So what happens in this memoir, which I think is really amazing, is that Clem writes the text and writes about what it's like for the family, the whole process of the diagnosis and treatment, given the other brother's suicide, and then what happens with Olivier, and then Olivier just does the illustrations. So like this, I wanted to put up this example, and on the left there, because it's so small, it's very hard to read it on the screen. But the key part here is that Clem writes, the diagnosis once delivered produced more confusion than clarity. Like everyone else, I knew little about schizophrenia, a disorder of the brain, they told us. There was no certainty about what caused it. There wasn't any cure. So that's kind of the narrative from Clem's, the brother's point of view. But you can see that the illustration, which is by Olivier, is really there's no words there at all. It's interestingly, he uses a pen to do a lot of kind of squiggly lines. Often this is in his drawings, so that it's almost like writing, but it's not writing. It's very hard to pull any meaning out of it. It seems like kind of a confused morass of shapes and lines, without any kind of meaning that can be attached to, like a social meaning. And yet there it is on the page, right? So that gesture, putting it on the page next to his brother's words, is significant. It's not because they worked on this together. So it's, even though it's a fairly lost kind of illustration, the fact that it's on the page next to his brother's words, it gives it a kind of power and meaning, and in my reading of it. So, but that's how the diagnosis affected them. No, go ahead. That's good. Keep me moving along. So I wanted to talk, so many of these memoirs deal with identity, with trauma, and with fragmentation. And I put these all together, though each one, of course, you could write dozens of books on, and people have. But I think, in terms of these memoirs, they tend to really be connected to each other, these concepts. So next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is another one of my favorites. And this memoir, this is the cover, just so you can see what it looks like. 100 Demons by Linda Berry. It's not explicitly a memoir about mental illness, but it's very much a memoir about childhood trauma, and then how the adult artist, in this case, has dealt with that trauma through creative acts, through the act of creating this memoir. And you can see even on the cover, one of the things that Linda Berry does is she creates a kind of scrapbook look to what she's doing, so that you have a real sense of her, first of all, of taking fragments, right? But the fragments are beautiful. I mean, they're very, aesthetically pleasing to look at. And I'm talking here about the little pieces of lace and fabric, and the kind of bric-a-brac and different colors and textures. There's a feeling of that we're looking at things that you could touch and they all feel differently, right? And so that there's always this kind of creative explosion around what she's doing. But there are also demons, and there's 100 demons. So we really get a sense of Berry trying to get control of these demons and transform them into something that she has a kind of creative control over. So next slide. So this is how Linda Berry represents herself. And I think this is something we'll see in a couple of the other ones, where the artist provides a really pretty unflattering illustration of themselves as a child. And in this case, I think this is how she felt as a child. Now, if you look at, she also has in different places photographs that she's incorporated, photographs of herself as a child that she's incorporated into the memoir. She doesn't look like this. She looks like a perfectly fine little child. But here, this is how she felt. She felt like an outsider. you guys quit walking so fast. Hey, she's always trying to catch up to the group. Um, she's Filipina American. Her father was Norwegian, her mother Filipina, and her mother was also half Filipina. Her father kind of disappeared after she was born, and that's a sort of unspoken part of the narrative, that there were things that happened back in the Philippines around the Second World War that affected the family. And those things are not really named, but they're definitely in the narrative. And there's a lot in this narrative about Linda Berry feeling like kind of like a monster herself, that she doesn't look right, she doesn't fit in. And she had an experience of childhood sexual abuse, which she talks about in this chapter. And she says, when your inner life is a place you have to stay out of, having an identity is impossible. Remembering not to remember fractures you. But what is the alternative? And this very, touching illustration of her, in bed saying, "Dad, I wish I was dead." And then saying the ability to exist in pieces is what some adults call resilience. And I suppose in some ways it is a kind of resilience, a horrible resilience that makes adults believe children forget trauma. And I think this is a really key part of this memoir. And we see her when she talks about existing in pieces, that she again is making something creative with those pieces, which is the memoir itself, and which is illustration and drawing and creativity. So next slide. So this is how she represents her mother. Her mother is very cruel to her in this memoir. She tries to tell her mother what happened to her. Her mother, doesn't want to hear. She's, "Where the hell were you last night?" And basically is like, "Smart mouth me, you prostitute." That's basically how her mother talks to her all the time. Her mother hits her as well. And here you can see like the words themselves that her mother's speaking, and that, in particular, are between them, right? The words keep them apart. Her mother's arms are folded over. There's no connection there. She's in the text. That's a place where in the text box, she's talking about being shattered. And then we have in the illustration, there's a tension there where we don't see a shattered person, but we see a child trying to talk to her mother and not being able to talk to her. And then interestingly, the scene of abuse, which is in the next panel, comes after this, even though it came before in time. And this is one of the examples of how this form manipulates time, so that just as the reader doesn't really know what shattered you, what is that about, and then we see this very kind of stylized scene of this very small child being approached by a man. And if you look in particular the doll, and the way the doll's legs are splayed out in this picture, as if she's being raped or sexually abused. There's some information there that doesn't come out in the words anywhere in this text, but we see it in that picture. And all that she says in the words is that she can't remember and she can't forget. But the illustration provides an entry into that memory, even though it's a very stylized one. Cartoonish is what I mean by that. It's kind of cartoonish. And of course, in that image, she's surrounded by poppies, like the flower of forgetfulness. So there's a lot of information there that's not spoken. Next slide, please. And just, this is the cover page for that chapter, which is called Resilience. She says, today, every chapter is a demon. And this one, it's interesting that the demon is not abuse, but the demon is resilience. And resilience becomes sort of the word that covers up what actually happened to her, that she can't speak. And we see there the doll, which is kind of merged together with Linda Berry herself in a way. Lifeless, dehumanized. There's like a smaller drawing of her older, still in that same kind of pose, leaning against the building as a teenager. So we see that how the impact, long-term impact of that abuse, and then the failure to have it acknowledged or have anyone help her with it. Um, and and here, this page is her creative expression of all of that. That that is the way that she tells the story as an adult. So next. Okay, I want to just briefly, in relation to that one, talk about racism as well, because as I mentioned, part of what you could go to the next slide. Part of what she talks about in this memoir is being treated basically from the Filipino side. Um, from the Filipino side, she looks too white, and even her mother says she looks too white, or she looks strange, right? As people tell her. But from the white side, she's considered dirty. Her house doesn't smell right, and she's kind of has to. Coming of age means learning that this is how people see her. So next slide. Thank you. And here we see, like, even her mother, again, and part of her mother's cruelty comes from racism against herself, and the idea that she can't really be pretty because she's not white, and so she, sort of projects that onto her daughter. So we see these, on the right hand panel, the sort of officially feminine, beautiful. White people, mother and daughter with their little doll. And then really the effect of that on not only each of the mother and daughter individually, Linda and her mother, but on their relationship, the effect of racism on their relationship. And her mother saying to her, Linda's saying, "Can I grow my hair long?" And her mother's, your hair would look like hell. And so that racism, in the society turns into abuse in the household, in this case. So, and that affects Linda's mental health, of course. So, next slide. Okay, so family is really important. Keep going. There's one more slide from Linda Berry, because I think while her mother is very cruel, her grandmother, who's in the green here, supports her and gives her a way of dealing with the mother. So there's family difficulty, but there's also family support. And in Filipino culture, there's a demon, a monster called the aswang, that is, a cruel and scary demon. And Linda Berry on the right hand says, monsters hardly ever started out as monsters. Something always transformed them. Was this also true of the aswang? And the grandmother says, but how did that lady become the aswang? The aswang is a female in this. And her grandmother says, ask your mommy, dear, basically acknowledging that her daughter is cruel as her daughter's become a kind of monster, the Linda's mother, and connecting that to, well, something happened to her to make her that way. How do people become monsters? Well, something happened to her, but that something remains silent in this memoir. So it's the complication of families when it comes to mental health, I think, gets portrayed here. So next slide. Okay, so this is from another wonderful memoir. So Nate Powell, who's a very highly recognized artist in the graphic form, wrote this. It's not exactly a memoir. I'm kind of cheating with this one, but it comes out of Nate Powell's experience of a decade working with people with developmental disabilities and also with mental illness. It's called Swallow Me Whole, and it's about a family where both the son and the daughter portrayed in this picture experience symptoms of psychosis and handle them in different ways. And there's a lot of, I put up this particular drawing because you can see that there's a kind of inwardness, a kind of sadness, and yet the family is very close to each other. And the daughter is very tied to her grandmother, who's very sick throughout the whole memoir. And so she's also dealing with a lot of grief and sadness about losing the grandmother. So you see that sadness and closeness portrayed, I think, very well in this illustration. Next one. Okay, so this is a little hard to see, and this again comes from Bitter Medicine, but this I think was, I wanted to include because it's about Clem's experience of taking his brother as a family member, taking his brother to the hospital. And he says, in other words, at the hospital, you'll experience an atmosphere of urgency and purpose. The prevailing sensations upon walking into a psychiatric ward are sadness, failure, and shame. Unlike in any other ward at the hospital, there is a feeling that this illness is someone's fault. And oddly, there is also a lingering sense of confusion. Those at the desk will resist diagnosing the ailment. Nobody will be able to tell you how long treatment will take, nor what treatment may involve. The front desk staff will either not have the precise information you require or will be forbidden to release it. And this is something many family members in this genre talk about, is not having access to information and feeling alienated within the hospital environment. So I wanted to include that from Clem Martini. Okay, next one. Okay, inner experience. This is actually probably the most important part of all this, is how inner experience of mental illness is portrayed. So next slide. And I put this up from Gail Hornstein, who wrote a wonderful book called Agnes's Jacket. She's a psychologist and a cultural studies scholar. Talking about psychological difficulties in terms of brain chemistry doesn't help us to understand family members or friends who have breakdowns, nor does it offer much insight into the frightening or mysterious parts of our minds. We all struggle to understand what happens to us. People who experience serious psychological difficulties are hardly exceptions. So next slide. And this is, what does it take on the part of the listener to receive the psychotic subject as a subject worth listening to, worth working to hear? And this is from Annie Rogers, who wrote 3 books, actually. She's a psychologist who also has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and has written beautifully about what it means to live with psychosis. She's not an illustrator, but I wanted to have her words in here anyway. She writes about art, actually, in one of her books. So next slide. Okay, so this is the cover of Nate Powell's Swallow Me Whole, and I'll talk about that cover in a minute. So you could go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to show a series of panels from this book, which portray Ruthie, who is having a psychotic episode throughout the book, and where she wants to be alone very much. She locks herself in her room. This is a portrayal of a friend that's trying to connect to her, and she just says, no, I need to be alone. And just seeing how the illustration, it's so shadowy and dark throughout the book, actually, which really reflects, I think, her state of mind. You could go to the next one. And so she has this image of, we see this image of her flying actually out of her room into the dark night. And you could go ahead and do the next one. I'm going to go through these quickly. So on her shelf, it's interesting. She collects insects, and she's very attuned to the lives of these insects. And sometimes we see they have little speech bubbles where they're talking to her. And so what's interesting is that on the previous slide, the shelves were empty. In this slide, they're full of these jars of insects. Yeah, thank you. That they're empty, full of the insects, and she's already flown out of the room. So that really kind of throws the reader off. It's like, are we supposed to think the insects are also a delusion, or are the empty shelves a delusion? Powell is really good at putting the reader in a state of what is real and wondering what is real and what is not real. So next one. So we see again in the top panel, this is one page, the insects are on the shelf saying, welcome, welcome. In the next panel below, these shelves are empty and she's lifting up almost as if, she's joining them and she's about to head out the window. Even though she has already left the window in the previous pages. So next one. And there she's just up in the sky. She's outside of the house, surrounded by whiteness. And there's a way that that the white is as oppressive in a certain way as the darkness. It's kind of, she's outside here. There's a kind of liberation, but the liberation is also oppressive. She's alone, right? She's surrounded by just space. The next one. And here we see her kind of floating above the suburban town where she lives. And even on the bottom panel there's like these little trick-or-treaters that kind of show up to give it even more of this sort of haunting sense of otherworldliness, where she's floating above. And again, everything in black and white with these very visible brush strokes that give you a sense of just kind of a really deep sadness and an aloneness. Next one. Okay, now this is another, a little bit of a cheat in a way. My favorite thing is Monsters is not strictly a memoir, but it draws a lot on Emile Ferris's experiences growing up in Chicago, feeling like an outsider, being kind of obsessed with werewolves and other monsters. And so yeah, you could go to the next one. So here, you don't have to be able to read this. It's almost impossible to read it on the page. But I think what's significant here is that the main character, Karen, again, as with Linda Berry, is represented in this kind of monstrous way. She's like a little werewolf, while the other people are drawn very realistically. So again, it's sort of this self-concept of being kind of a monster that gets externalized into the drawing. In this case, she's just learned that her mother is very sick and is going to die soon. And so she's dealing with this information. And this is, her brother is also there when the mother tells them. Next slide. So instead of like staying with the family, Karen goes out to the cemetery. And she has this elaborate story that she begins to tell, that if she can just find the right werewolves and the right monsters, she'll get the key to eternal life and be able to save her mother from dying. So, and she makes a promise, I will find us a maker and get the bite and bring it home to you in D's, and we'll live forever together. So it's like grief, trying to deal with grief through creating this monster that is herself, right? Next one. And there we see her turn back into kind of a real person, right? And when she's a real person, the thought is, it's a stupid thing that I'm trying to do. It's a stupid belief, stupid. So when she's a real person, that's where her mind goes. And so being a monster is kind of better. So if you go to the next slide. This is just about thinking about the unexpected again. And you can go ahead to the next one, because I want to get to this. Yeah. Okay, so here's Karen again. And we see this really scary figure that almost looks like it's about to eat her. And instead she's saying, thanks, thanks. Because she says here, monsters always beat cancer. Monsters always beat cancer. She goes to the monster for help. And so to her, even though this monster is really scary, she is looking to the monster for help and for relief. And there's something in that image of the power of the monster. If it's so scary, it must be more powerful than death, more powerful than cancer. So the illustration is the answer to that fear and grief. Next one. Okay, this is back to marbles. And I think this, especially the one on the left here, is I think just a really amazing illustration of what Forney feels like when she's in an episode particularly a manic episode, doesn't know which way is up or down, has no self. Everything is penetrated. Everything is there's, she's vacated and of selfhood. So okay, I want to make sure we have time for the Q&A. So I'm going to ask. I have more, but Dave, if you could go forward, and I'll tell you just yeah, intergenerational trauma. Keep going with this. Go for it. I did want to just you could go ahead. Just touch on. You could stop there. Intergenerational trauma, which is a wonderful memoir called Flying Couch, by a third generation Holocaust, granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, who again uses illustration to deal with her grandmother's experiences in the Holocaust, as Ari Spiegelman was doing as well. And so that's another place where, the family intergenerational trauma is dealt with in this. So I wanted to show a couple slides that have to do with meds. So Dave, if you could go further on, just back to marbles, keep going. Okay, yeah, keep going. Let's go one more there. And so this is a good, both of those stay on that one. So Forney has this these great panels where she's, you can get a merit badge for all the different meds that you try when you have bipolar, and then they stop working, or they become toxic, or they, you have horrible side effects. And this goes on for like 3 pages of the memoir with her. And it's very funny, actually, but also horrible at the same time. So she's able to convey both of those feelings by representing these different medications. And so I just love this. I think it's great. So let's go. I think I want to stop there, though I have more I could say, but let's stop there and just go to the very end. Keep going. And this is just about living, like, what it's like to live with mental health challenges. We see Olivier portraying that, just being at work, being with his friends, and also Forney learning to live with bipolar is a big part of these memoirs. Okay, go to the last slide, and because I want people. Oops. Oh, I thought there was one more. Oh, no, there's not. Okay. Well, I meant there to be one more, which is about letting people know about the Graphic Medicine International Collective. So actually, if you just Google that, Graphic Medicine International Collective, they have conferences, and it's not just about mental health, it's about all aspects of health. It's a collective that started in 2019, partly by a guy, Michael Green, who's at Penn State, and bioethicist, I think, and physician, and which is all about using graphic forms, comics, graphic memoir, graphic novels in medical practice. So it's a very cool site if you want to, and they actually have a manifesto. So that's all for now. I want to make sure there's time for some questions, and I'm sorry I did run over what I had intended the time I intended to take. So.
No, that was wonderful.